Welcome to another slow descent into sleep. Tonight's story opens on a pot, boiling in the dim glow of a single tallow candle, its steam curling into shapes that almost look like words. The year is 1316. The rain has turned the roads to rivers, and hunger has made poets of desperate men. In this kitchen, recipes are written in whispers, and every ingredient is a confession. Some are gathered from the forest floor, some traded in the shadows, and some from places no one will name while the fire is burning. They call it the cookbook for the famished soul, but those who have tasted its dishes know it is more than food. It is a bargain. It is a memory. It is a way to make the body forget the truth for one more night. Let the rain hush the world outside. Let the broth keep its secrets. And if these quiet wanderings bring you comfort, you might consider subscribing or telling us where and when you're listening from. Now close your eyes and turn the first page of the cookbook that should never have been written, being a practical guide to sustenance during the great want of our Lord's years 1315 to 1317, when the rains came and would not cease, and the earth gave up nothing good. Leather takes longer than you think. Soften with rainwater. Serve alone. The boot, when properly selected, should be neither too new nor entirely beyond salvation. One finds that the boots of the recently deceased serve admirably for this purpose, though the living are often reluctant to part with their footwear, even when it has become more whole than leather. This reluctance is understandable, if ultimately futile. The dead, by contrast, have no use for boots, and their feet have grown quite beyond caring about the cold. Begin by examining the sole. If it still bears the shape of a foot, this is promising. If it has worn through entirely, leaving only the memory of where leather once existed, you may proceed anyway. The imagination during these times has become as nourishing as any actual substance. Set the boot beside your fire, assuming you have managed to coax flame from whatever damp wood the forest has grudgingly provided, and contemplate its journey. This boot has walked through mud that never dried, has stepped over the bodies of cattle that simply laid down one morning and forgot to rise, has carried its wearer past empty granaries and shuttered markets where no grain moved because there was no grain to move. The water for boiling should be collected from the most recent rain. There is always recent rain. The rain began in the spring of 1315, when the crops should have been planted, and has continued with the persistence of a monk at prayer, except that monks, being practical men, occasionally pause to sleep. The rain does not sleep. It falls upon the flooded fields where barley rots in black pools, upon the roads that have become rivers of mud, upon the thatch that no longer keeps anything dry. This rain has acquired a particular flavor, not unpleasant, merely resigned. It tastes of disappointment and wet stones. Fill your largest pot with this rainwater. If you have no pot, a helmet will suffice. If you have no helmet, cup your hands and boil the water in small quantities. Though this method requires considerable patience and steady hands, patience, at least, has become abundant during these years of want. There is little else to do but wait for the rain to stop, for the grain to grow, for the dying to finish their business and make room for the rest. Place the boot into the cold water. Do not be startled if it floats initially. Leather, when properly prepared, maintains an air of optimism that persists, even under the most trying circumstances. Weight it down with a stone if necessary. The same stones that once marked property lines now serve many purposes, as property itself has become a negotiable concept. A man who owns land that will grow nothing is, in practical terms, no wealthier than a man who owns nothing at all. Bring the water to a gentle boil. This may take some time, as fires burn poorly when fed with wood that has forgotten what dryness feels like. While you wait, consider the boot's previous life. It once protected tender flesh from sharp stones and thorns. It kept feet warm during winters that seemed harsh then, but appear almost quaint in memory. It may have danced at a harvest festival back when harvests occurred and festivals were possible. Now it will provide a different kind of service, not protection, but sustenance, or at least the idea of sustenance, which has become nearly as valuable. The leather will begin to soften after the first hour of boiling. Do not expect dramatic transformation. This is not magic, merely persistence applied to necessity. The boot will release certain flavors into the water salt from sweat, earth from countless journeys, and something that might charitably be called essence of cow, assuming the leather came from a cow and not from something that merely resembled one. During these times of scarcity, the origin of leather has become less certain, and perhaps it is better not to inquire too closely. After 2 hours, the boot should yield slightly to pressure. This is not tenderness in any meaningful sense, but rather a grudging acknowledgement that further resistance is pointless. Remove it from the pot and set it aside to cool. The broth that remains will be brown and slightly thick, with an aroma that suggests it might once have been food, if one approaches the concept of food with sufficient flexibility. The eating of the boot requires meditation. Cut it into small pieces, using whatever blade remains sharp enough for the task. If no such blade exists, tearing by hand is acceptable, though this method demands a philosophical approach to dining. Chew each piece slowly and thoroughly. The leather will resist the teeth with dignified stubbornness, releasing its meager nourishment only to those willing to work for it. This is as it should be. Nothing worthwhile has ever come easily, and boiled boot is no exception to this rule. Some have attempted to improve the flavor of boot with herbs, nettles, if they can be found, or the inner bark of elm trees, or clover that has somehow survived the endless rain. These additions are not necessary, but they provide the illusion of choice, which can be as nourishing to the spirit as actual food is to the body. The spirit, however, requires less frequent feeding, and complains less vigorously when neglected. There was a woman in the village who saved her husband's boots, after he died of the fever that comes from eating grain that has gone green with mold. She boiled them with great ceremony, inviting neighbors to witness the preparation. The neighbors came, though they had no boots to contribute to the meal. They sat quietly around her fire and watched the leather surrender to the heat. When the boot was finally ready, she served it on her finest wooden plate, the one carved with roses that her husband had made during their first year of marriage, when roses were common and marriage seemed like a permanent arrangement. She ate the boot slowly, with dignity, while the neighbors watched and said nothing. When she finished, she thanked her husband for providing one final meal. Then she folded her hands and waited for spring. Spring, when it finally came, brought only more rain. The broth should be sipped while still warm. Cold boot broth loses what little character it possesses and becomes merely liquid disappointment. Hot, it retains a certain presence, not pleasant, perhaps, but undeniably there, which is more than can be said for many things during these times. Hold the bowl with both hands and let the warmths seep through the wood or clay into your palms. This warmth is as much nourishment as the broth itself, and considerably more reliable. If there are children present, they may be given small portions of the softer pieces. Children adapt to circumstances with remarkable resilience, accepting boiled boot as readily as they once accepted honey cakes and fresh bread. They do not question why food has become strange. They simply adjust their expectations and continue growing, though perhaps more slowly than before. They learn new games counting ribs beneath skin, finding entertainment in the patterns that hunger creates on empty faces, pretending that bark tea is actually tea. The remainder of the boot may be saved for the following day, though it will have lost much of its modest appeal by then. Cold boiled boot possesses all the charm of a wet glove and approximately the same nutritional value. Still, waste during these times approaches the level of sin, and throwing away even questionable food requires justification that few can provide. Better to eat cold boot than to explain to empty stomachs why perfectly edible leather was discarded. Before retiring for the night, clean the pot thoroughly. This serves no practical purpose, as there is rarely enough food to require a truly clean cooking vessel. But the maintenance of standards provides a small defense against the general collapse of civilization. A clean pot suggests that normal meals might return someday, that proper cooking might again become possible, that the world might remember how to function as it once did. These suggestions are almost certainly false, but they cost nothing and harm no one. Store any remaining broth in a covered container. It will keep for several days, developing a rich complexity of flavor that some might mistake for spoilage. Do not be deceived. This is merely the boot broth achieving its full potential. Like wine, it improves with age, though the improvement is subtle and requires an educated palate to appreciate. Most palates, during these times, have become sufficiently educated through necessity. The bones of the foot that once wore the boot lie somewhere in the churchyard, growing soft in the endless rain. The priest has given up trying to keep the graves dry. The dead seem to mind the water less than the living do. They rest quietly in their muddy beds, their feet free at last from the constraint of boots. while above ground their abandoned footwear serves a new purpose. There is a certain poetry in this arrangement, though it is the sort of poetry that few would choose to experience firsthand. Sleep comes more easily on a stomach that contains something, even if that something is leather seasoned with resignation and served with a side of grim necessity. The mind, mercifully, does not distinguish between proper food and boiled boot. When the body has been empty for too long, it accepts what is offered and asks no questions. Dreams, when they come, are often of bread and meat and sweet wine, not as torment, but as gentle reminders that such things once existed and might, in some distant future, exist again. The rain continues against the shutters, steady and patient and utterly without malice. It falls equally upon the just and the unjust, upon the fed and the starving, upon the living and the dead. In this there is a kind of fairness that might be comforting, if one were inclined to find comfort in such things. The rain asks nothing and promises nothing. It simply continues, as reliable as sunrise, and considerably more frequent. And in the morning there will be fresh water for the next boot, should one be fortunate enough to locate another soul worth boiling. Skin first. Avoid the tail. Searing improves morale, not flavor. The procurement of rats during these lean years has become a matter requiring both patience and a certain flexibility regarding one's relationship with dignity. The creatures themselves have grown wary, as if sensing their elevation from mere pest to potential sustenance. They move differently, nowless, boldly through granaries that contain no grain, more cautiously past empty barrels that once held ale and now hold only the memory of ale, which rats, being practical creatures, cannot consume. A rat in good condition weighs perhaps as much as a small prayer book, though considerably less than hope. The larger specimens, those that have managed to maintain their flesh despite the general scarcity, are often the wisest and therefore the most difficult to catch. They have learned to avoid the obvious traps, the boxes balanced on sticks, the pits covered with thin straw, the snares made from hair pulled from the heads of the patient, hungry. These rats have developed what might be called cunning, if one were inclined to credit rodents with intellectual capacity. Perhaps it is merely that only the clever rats remain alive, the foolish ones having already contributed to someone's supper. The best hunting occurs in the hours before dawn, when the rats venture forth to search for whatever the day's previous disappointments might have left behind. They move through houses grown quiet with exhaustion, past beds where children sleep fitfully and dream of things that cannot be eaten, toys and songs and the sound of laughter that comes from bellies full enough to permit joy. The rats nose around cold hearths where no cooking smells linger, investigate corners where no crumbs fall, and gradually grow bold enough to cross open spaces where desperate hands might wait. To catch a rat requires thinking like a rat, which is to say, thinking like a creature that expects nothing good but hopes nonetheless for something edible. Set your trap near water sources, as rats, like people, can survive longer without food than without drink. A puddle beneath a leaking roof serves admirably. The rain provides constant replenishment, and the sound of dripping creates a small music that might mask the slight sounds of trap mechanism engaging. Place the beta fragment of moldy cheese, a piece of rancid fat, anything that might once have been food at a distance that requires the rat to commit fully to the endeavor. The waiting that follows is a meditation on desire and necessity. One sits in darkness, listening for the soft scratch of claws on wood, the almost inaudible whisper of whiskers testing air for danger. These sounds arrive eventually, or they do not. There is no predicting the hunger of rats any more than there is predicting the hunger of people. Both follow mysterious rhythms that seem to have little relation to need or logic. When fortune provides a ratant fortune during these times, measures its gifts in surprisingly small increments, the work begins immediately. The creature must be dispatched swiftly and with gratitude, though the gratitude may be complex in nature. One is grateful for the protein, naturally, but also grateful to the rat for its service, and perhaps grateful that one's circumstances have not yet fallen so far as to make rats seem like luxury rather than necessity. This last gratitude is premature. There are depths yet unexplored. The skinning requires a steady hand and a knife sharp enough to part fur from flesh without destroying either. Begin at the hind legs and work forward, peeling the skin away like removing a tight glove from a small, unfortunate hand. The fur comes away cleanly if the rat was healthy, though healthy rats have become increasingly rare. Many show signs of the same deprivation that affects their human neighbors' thin haunches, prominent ribs, a general air of having made do with less than optimal circumstances. Reserve the skin. It has uses beyond the immediate meal. Dried rat hide makes acceptable patches for clothing that has worn thin, and during these times, most clothing falls into this category. The fur, while not luxurious, provides some insulation when stuffed between layers of cloth. Every part of the rat serves some purpose, much like every part of a prayer, though the effectiveness of both depends greatly on the faith of the person employing them. The cleaned carcass resembles, with only slight imagination, a very small rabbit. If rabbits had become scarce enough to seem mythical rather than merely absent, the flesh is dark and lean, having the texture of something that worked hard for its living. This is not the soft, pampered meat of animals raised for slaughter in times of plenty, but the practical flesh of creatures that earned every ounce through constant vigilance and creative scavenging. Preparation may follow several approaches. The simplest involves roasting. The rat hole over whatever fire can be maintained with damp wood and stubborn determination. Thread the carcass on a thin sticker knitting needle serves admirably, and most knitting needles have found new purposes since the wool ran out, and there became little point in creating new clothing when the old was far from worn through. Turn the rat slowly above the flames, allowing the heat to penetrate evenly, while the skin darkens and begins to release what might generously be called aroma. The smell of cooking rat is distinctive without being entirely unpleasant. It suggests roasted meat, the way that candlelight suggests the sunnah, distant relation, that provides some comfort but cannot be mistaken for the original. Those who have never experienced true hunger might find the smell off-putting, but those who have learned to measure time by the intervals between meals discover their standards becoming wonderfully flexible. The nose, like the stomach, adapts to circumstances with remarkable speed. Alternatively, the rat may be divided into portions and added to whatever soup currently occupies the cookpot. Most cookpots, during these times, contain a perpetual stew that never quite empties and never quite fills. Mixture of whatever can be found, boiled together in the hope that combination might improve what the individual ingredients lack. A rat added to such a stew contributes substance, if not flavor, and substance has become the more valuable quality. The cooking time varies depending on the size of the rat and the enthusiasm of the fire, but generally the meat is ready when it yields to gentle pressure, and the bones can be separated without excessive force. Undercooked rat presents certain digestive challenges, while overcooked rat becomes leather with even less charm than actual leather. There exists a brief moment of perfection between these extremes, and finding it requires attention and experience, and a kind of culinary intuition that develops naturally when every meal matters. Serve the rat immediately while still warm. Cold rat, like cold boot, loses whatever appeal it possessed when hot, and becomes merely protein with delusions of adequacy. If there are others to feed, divide the portions according to need rather than desire. Children require less meat, but more encouragement. Adults require more meat, but less explanation of what they are eating. The elderly require portions sized for their diminished appetites, but benefit from being allowed to believe, if they wish, that they are eating something other than rat. The bones should be saved and added to the next pot of broth. Rat bones, when boiled sufficiently long, yield a thin soup with a flavor that suggests nutrition, even if the actual nutritional content remains modest. The marrow, such as it is, provides richness to the broth and creates the illusion of having eaten something substantial. Illusions, during these times, deserve respect and careful cultivation. In the village, there was a man who became known for his skill at catching rats. He fashioned traps from salvaged wire and broken pottery, baited them with scraps too small for human consumption, and checked them with the regularity of a monk attending prayers. He caught more rats than seemed possible, given the general scarcity, and shared them according to a system of his own devising that took into account family size, accumulated debts, and the likelihood of repayment when circumstances improved. He never ate rat himself, claiming his stomach had grown too delicate for such fare, but he accepted payment in the form of firewood or mending, or simply the promise of future consideration when better food returned. When the rats finally grew too scarce to hunt, he packed his traps carefully away and turned to other pursuits. He was found one morning in his bed, dead of starvation, surrounded by well-maintained rat traps and a carefully organized collection of small bones. The eating of rat requires a certain mental preparation. The mind must be convinced to view the meat as food rather than as rat, which sounds simpler than it proves in practice. One helpful approach involves concentrating on the texture rather than the origin, focusing on the protein and warmth rather than the source of these benefits. The meat, when properly cooked, tears cleanly and has a grain similar to dark poultry, if one remembers what poultry tasted like. Some attempt to improve the flavor through seasoning. Those spices become as scarce as mercy and considerably more expensive. Salt, when available, helps considerably, as does any herb that can be gathered from gardens gone wild or fields abandoned to their own devices. Wild garlic grows in some places, though it must compete with the people hunting for it, and the competition has grown fierce. A pinch of dried mint pear can transform rat from merely edible to something approaching palatable, though mint requires the kind of forward planning that assumes there will be future meals to season. The tail, as noted, should be avoided. This instruction seems obvious, but hunger can cloud judgment and make even unpromising portions seem worth the effort. The rat's tail contains little meat and much gristle, and its appearance on a plate does nothing to maintain the illusion that one is eating something other than rodent. Better to discard it entirely than to confront evidence that cannot be argued away through creative interpretation. After the meal, clean the cookware thoroughly and store any remaining portions carefully. Leftover rat keeps poorly and spoils quickly, developing flavors that make the original seem sophisticated by comparison. It is better to eat everything immediately, despite the resulting discomfort of having consumed more food than the stomach has grown accustomed to processing. Blend to save portions that will become inedible by morning. The successful hunting and consumption of rat provides not only nourishment, but also a certain psychological benefit. The satisfaction of having solved a problem through skill and persistence, rather than through luck or charity. There is dignity in feeding oneself, even when the food would have been unthinkable under previous circumstances. The rat asked for nothing when it lived, and provides what it can when it dies, which is more than can be said for many creatures that demanded care and offered little in return. Sleep comes differently after a meal of rat nut, because the meat is particularly satisfying, but because the stomach contains something solid, enough to be recognized as food. The dreams that follow may be of better meals, but they lack the desperate quality of dreams born from complete emptiness. There is comfort in knowing that tomorrow's hunger will be familiar rather than total, manageable rather than overwhelming. The rat, in death, provides a small bridge across the vast space between meals, and bridges, however modest, deserve acknowledgement for the service they provide. Outside, the rain continues with its customary persistence, washing clean the places where traps were set and tracks were followed. By morning, new rats may venture forth, or they may not. The hunt begins again with the patience of those who have learned that survival requires accepting small victories and modest portions, that life during lean times is measured in rat-sized increments, rather than feast-sized celebrations. And perhaps this is not such a terrible way to measure existence. carefully, gratefully, one small blessing at a time. Add bark shavings. Do not confuse with actual pie. The construction of mud pie requires first a philosophical adjustment regarding the nature of both mud and pie. Traditional pie suggests pastry and filling, sweetness and substance, the marriage of intention and ingredient in pursuit of pleasure. Mud pie during the Great Want suggests none of these things. Instead, it offers an exercise in creative nomenclature. Calling something pie does not make it pie, but it makes the eating of it marginally more tolerable, which is achievement enough. The mud itself must be selected with care. Not all mud serves the purpose equally well. Mud from roads traveled by sick animals carries dangers that even hunger cannot justify accepting. Mud from areas where the dead have been buried, however expeditiously, presents risks that outweigh any potential nourishment. The ideal mud comes from places where rain has mixed clean earth with rainwater, creating a consistency that suggests substance without actual menace to health, such as health remains under current circumstances. Clay-rich soil provides the most satisfactory mud for culinary purposes. It holds together well when shaped and does not dissolve entirely when heated. Such soil can be found near riverbanks, though the rivers themselves have grown unreliable, sometimes running where they never ran before, and sometimes refusing to run where they always had. The earth, like everything else during these times, has become unpredictable in its behavior and modest in its offerings. Collect the mud in the early morning, when it has absorbed the night's rain, but not yet been disturbed by the day's traffic. Traffic, admittedly, has decreased considerably since the roads became impassable and most destinations ceased to offer anything worth the journey. Still, what movement remains tends to contaminate mud with substances better avoided and pure mudef. Such a concept can be entertained without irony, represents a luxury worth protecting. The vessel for mud pie may be any container capable of withstanding heat without cracking entirely. Most pottery has developed some relationship with breakage during these years of hard use and frequent temperature changes, but containers need only survive long enough to complete their immediate purpose. A cracked pot that holds mud adequately serves as well as a perfect pot that holds nothing at all, because perfect pots have become theoretical rather than practical objects. Begin by straining the mud through cloth to remove the larger debris stones, twigs, items that clearly do not belong in anything pretending to be food. A piece of linen torn from a shift that has grown too large for its wearer serves admirably for this purpose. Clothing, like people, has lost substance during these lean years, and garments that once fit properly now hang loose and provide fabric for unexpected uses. The linen should be clean, or as clean as anything can be when soap has become a memory, and hot water requires fuel that might better be saved for cooking. The straining process reveals the optimistic nature of mud pie preparation. What remains after removing the obviously inedible still cannot be called food by any honest definition. Yet, the act of straining creates the impression that something edible might emerge from the process. This impression is valuable in itself, providing hope in a form that can be measured and shaped and placed in the fire to cook. Mix the strained mud with water until it achieves a consistency similar to thick porridge. If porridge were made from earth rather than grain, the water should be fresh rainwater when possible, as rainwater during these times has become the most reliable fluid available. Well water, where wells still function, often carries the flavor of desperation, too many people drawing from too little supply. Too much hope placed in sources never meant to support entire communities. The ash that forms the crust comes from fires built with whatever wood can be gathered from forests that have learned to guard their bounty jealously. Wet wood burns reluctantly, producing ash mixed with charcoal and the tears of those who tend fires that refuse to burn properly. This ash, when cooled and sifted, provides a coating that creates the impression of crust around the mud filling. It neither improves the flavor nor adds nutrition, but it transforms shapeless mud into something that resembles food enough to be eaten without complete loss of dignity. Add bark shavings to provide texture and the suggestion of substance. The inner bark of birch trees, when available, adds slight sweetness and chews acceptably. Elm bark provides bulk and a faint flavor that might remind one of nuts. If memory can be trusted and nuts had not become mythical rather than merely scarce, pine bark should be avoided unless desperation has reached levels that make all caution seem luxurious, as it provides more sensation than nourishment, and the sensation is not entirely pleasant. The bark must be prepared, carefully scraped with a knife to remove the rough outer layer, then shaved thin enough to chew, without requiring teeth stronger than most people possess after months of poor nutrition. Thick bark shavings transform mud pie from merely unappetizing to actually dangerous, capable of damaging mouths already made tender by deficient diet and inadequate care. Shape the mud mixture into a form that suggests pie through optimism rather than accuracy. The shape need not be perfect. Perfection in food preparation has become a concept for times when there was enough food. Permit concern about presentation. Press the mixture into the container firmly enough to hold together, but gently enough to avoid compressing it into something indistinguishable from simple mud. The distinction between mud pie and mud lies primarily in intention and preparation, rather than in any fundamental difference of substance. Sprinkle the ash evenly over the surface, creating a crust that looks more convincing than it tastes. The ash should be fine enough to stay in place, but not so fine as to disappear entirely when the pie is handled. Achieving this balance requires experience gained through trials that few would choose to undertake voluntarily, but many have been forced to master through circumstances beyond their control. Place the pie near the fire to dry rather than to cook, as cooking implies transformation into something edibly improved, which lies beyond the capabilities of mud regardless of preparation method. The drying process takes several hours and fills the air with an aroma that suggests pottery being fired rather than food being prepared. This aroma is not unpleasant, merely irrelevant to appetite in any conventional sense. During the drying process, Consider the philosophical implications of preparing food that is not food. The act of cooking, even when applied to inedible materials, maintains human dignity in small ways. It suggests that standards exist even when they cannot be met, that civilization persists even when its expressions become increasingly abstract. The ritual of food preparation provides comfort that transcends the actual nourishment derived from the meal. In the monastery nearby, the monks have begun including mud pie in their studies of holy suffering. They view the consumption of earth as a form of communion with creation in its most basic form, though they acknowledge that God likely intended earth to remain beneath feet rather than between teeth. The abbot has declared mud pie acceptable during Lent, noting that it provides penance sufficient for any sin, while requiring no enforcement beyond its own nature. The monks eat their portions in silence, which has become easy since there seems little worth saying about the meal. When the pie has dried sufficiently, remove it from the fire and allow it to cool until it can be handled without causing burns. The cooling process should not be rushed, as hot mud pie provides even less satisfaction than warm mud pie, and considerably less than mud pie at room temperature. Though none of these temperatures transform mud into anything resembling actual food. Serve the pie in portions appropriate to the number of people requiring food and the amount of mud available. Portion size matters less than the ceremony of division. The acknowledgement that what little exists should be shared according to need, rather than hoarded according to fear. The sharing of mud pie creates community around the common experience of making do with what cannot possibly be enough. The eating technique requires modification of normal approaches to consuming pie. Small bites work better than large ones, as large bites of mud pie can overwhelm the mouth's ability to process material. That challenges the definition of food. Chew thoroughly and swallow deliberately, allowing the mud to mix with saliva until it achieves a consistency that will not cause immediate distress when it reaches the stomach. The bark shavings provide welcome relief from the uniformity of mud texture. They offer something to chew that responds differently to the teeth, creating the illusion of variety within what is essentially a single ingredient meal. Chew each bark shaving completely before attempting to swallow, as inadequately chewed bark can create digestive complications. That hunger alone provides sufficient quantity of already. Some have attempted to improve mud pie through Atten's crushed acorns when they can be found, though acorns require extensive preparation to become even marginally edible, or wild onions, which add flavor that might distract from the essential earthiness of the main ingredient. These improvements are largely theoretical, as they require finding additional ingredients when finding mud alone represents a significant accomplishment. The aftertaste of mud pie lingers with determination, coating the mouth with a mineral flavor that suggests having licked stones, which some have indeed been reduced to doing when even mud becomes scarce. This aftertaste can be partially mitigated by drinking water immediately after each bite, though water should not be wasted on comfort when it may be needed for more practical purposes, like dissolving tomorrow's mud into something resembling soup. After the meal, clean the eating vessels as thoroughly as possible, given the limitations of available water and cleaning materials. Mud adheres with impressive persistence, requiring scrubbing that consumes more energy than the meal provided. This irony that cleaning up after eating mud pie requires more effort than preparing it reflects the general inversion of normal relationships that characterizes existence during the Great Want. The nutritional value of mud pie approaches zero, while remaining technically above zero, which places it in the category of foods that sustain life without supporting it. The stomach registers the presence of substance without experiencing satisfaction, creating a sensation of having eaten something while remaining essentially hungry. This partial fullness may be worse than complete emptiness, as it provides just enough sensation to remind the body of what real food feels like, without delivering any of food's actual benefits. Storage of leftover mud pie presents unnecessary complications, as the pie keeps indefinitely without spoiling, spoilage implying change from a more desirable state to a less desirable one. Mud pie begins and remains in a consistent state of being marginally edible at best, neither improving nor deteriorating with time. This stability represents one of its few advantages over conventional food, which has become unreliable in its willingness to remain consumable. The dreams that follow a meal of mud pie tend toward the earthy and basic dreams of growing things, of roots extending deep into soil, of becoming one with the ground in ways that living people rarely contemplate voluntarily. These dreams may represent the mind's attempt to find meaning in consuming earth, or they may simply reflect the natural response to eating material that belongs underground rather than in the stomach. Yet there is something to be said for mud pie beyond its modest contribution to survival. It represents human adaptability taken to its logical extreme. The willingness to redefine food rather than accept starvation. To maintain the rituals of eating even when the substance being consumed challenges every assumption about what eating means. In this, mud pie achieves a kind of dignity, not the dignity of proper food, but the dignity of creative persistence in the face of impossible circumstances. The rain outside continues its patient work of creating tomorrow's mud, falling on earth that has grown accustomed to being dissolved and reformed, shaped and reshaped by hands desperate enough to find nourishment in dirt. The mud waits, patient and reliable, offering what it can to those who have learned to accept offerings that would have seemed impossible to accept when possibilities seemed unlimited, rather than reduced to the choice between mud pie and nothing at all. And in this terrible reliability, there is a kind of comfort, not the comfort of satisfaction, but the comfort of knowing that earth, at least, will always be available to those willing to eat it. Put a bowl out anyway. Pretend they might come. Close the shutters. The preparation of meals for guests who will not arrive has become a common practice during these years of diminished expectations and expanded solitude. The guest may have been expected based on old promises made when promises seemed keepable, or on hope that persists despite evidence suggesting hope has become impractical, or on the simple human need to believe that somewhere someone might still be traveling toward warmth and welcome rather than away from cold and disappointment. Setting a place for absent guests requires no additional food, which represents a significant advantage during times when food for present diners remains theoretical rather than actual. The empty bowl serves multiple purposes. It maintains the illusion of hospitality, provides a focus for hope that transcends reason, and creates a small ceremony around the act of eating alone, transforming solitude from abandonment into choice. The table, such as it remains after being used for fuel during particularly cold nights, should be cleared of everything except the essential items. For dine-in, this includes removing the small bones that accumulate from previous meals, the scraps of bark that resist all attempts at consumption, the patches of candle wax that have dripped during evenings when envoy for company rather than a surface that has been abandoned to the practical demands of survival. Polish the existing bowls with whatever cloth can be spared for the purpose. The bowls themselves may be cracked or chipped, casualties of use that has become rough through necessity, but they should be as clean as circumstances permit. A cracked bowl that gleams with attention paid to its care suggests that civilized behavior continues despite uncivilized circumstances, that standards persist even when they cannot be fully met. Place the cleanest bowl at the position where the absent guest would sit if they were present instead of absent. This position should be opposite the host, creating the spatial relationship that encourages conversation. Though conversation with absent guests requires different skills than conversation with present ones and produces different results, most of them internal rather than audible. The absent guest's bowl should remain empty throughout the meal, serving as both invitation and memorial invitation to whatever hope suggested the guest might arrive, memorial to whatever relationship once made their arrival seem possible. An empty bowl on a table where someone sits alone creates a presence more powerful than most actual presences, though considerably less helpful when it comes to sharing either food or conversation. Light whatever candle can be spared for the occasion, though candles have become precious enough to reserve for genuinely special circumstances, and meals for guests who do not arrive may not qualify as special enough to justify the expense. If no candle exists, a small fire in a dish will serve, fed with splinters of wood too small for cooking but sufficient for creating the gentle light that makes solitary meals seem less like evidence of abandonment and more like expressions of patient faith. The meal itself should be prepared as if the guest were actually expected rather than merely hoped for. This means taking whatever care is possible with presentation, arranging the meager, available food in patterns that suggest intention rather than desperation, and serving portions that assume sharing rather than solitary consumption. The act of preparing food for two when only one will eat creates a generosity of spirit that transcends the actual scarcity of the meal. If the available food consists of bark, soup water in which tree bark has been boiled until it surrenders whatever nutrients trees can spare for human sustenance, serve it in both bowls anyway. The guest's portion will cool untouched, creating a small sacrifice that honors both the absent person and the idea that hospitality continues to matter even when there is little hospitality left to offer. Cold bark soup possesses even less appeal than warm bark soup, but the waste involved in preparing food that will not be eaten represents a kind of luxury, a refusal to reduce all behavior to its most practical applications. Speak aloud to the empty chair, as if conversation were actually taking place. This practice may seem to suggest mental deterioration brought on by isolation and poor nutrition, but it actually represents mental discipline, the conscious choice to maintain social skills that would otherwise atrophy from disuse. Tell the absent guest about the day's small events. Which birds were spotted despite the general absence of birds? What the quality of the morning's rainwater suggested about the afternoon's weather? How the fire burned compared to previous days when the wood was either more or less cooperative. The absent guest never interrupts, never disagrees, never fails to appreciate whatever insights are offered. In this, absent guests prove superior to present ones in many ways, though their superiority comes at the cost of being unable to provide any actual companionship, assistance with difficult tasks, or confirmation that the speaker's observations about reality bear any resemblance to objective truth. These are significant limitations. But during times when present guests have become scarce, absent guests provide what comfort they can. Some have taken to preparing elaborate meals for absent guests, setting out multiple courses of food that does not exist, describing in detail the preparation methods used for ingredients that cannot be obtained, discussing the flavors and textures of dishes that remain purely theoretical. This practice requires considerable imagination and may suggest that hunger has progressed beyond the physical into the realm of the psychological, where the mind begins eating memories and possibilities instead of actual substances. The village blacksmith used to prepare Sunday dinner for his departed wife, setting her place with their best remaining crockery and serving portions of whatever he had managed to find during the week. He would tell her about his customers, though customers had become rare as metalwork that required payment in actual currency rather than barter or promises. He described the weather, though the weather had become monotonously wet, and shared his plans for the coming week, though planning had become an increasingly theoretical exercise. After the meal, he would clear her place carefully and save her untouched portion for the next day, when it would become his breakfast. This arrangement continued until he ran out of food to serve to absent guests, at which point he joined his wife in whatever realm absent guests inhabit permanently rather than just during mealtimes. The conversation with absent guests should cover topics that living guests might find either boring or distressing. Discuss the precise texture of different types of bark when chewed. The way rain sounds different when it falls on thatch that has grown thin versus thatch that still maintains some weather-blocking capacity. The methods used to determine whether food that might be spoiled is spoiled enough to avoid or merely spoiled enough to require extra chewing. Living guests might find such topics depressing, but absent guests accept all conversation with equal grace. Include the absent guest in decisions about household management, though their advice will necessarily be inferred rather than explicitly stated. Ask their opinion about whether to burn the remaining chair for fuel or save it in case circumstances improve enough to make sitting in chairs seem worthwhile again. Discuss the merits of different approaches to catching mice. Assuming mice remain available for catching, seek their counsel about whether to trade the last good knife for a handful of grain. Assuming anyone has grain to trade and assuming the knife remains good enough to interest potential trading partners. The absent guest's silence in response to these questions creates space for the host to explore different possible answers, effectively consulting their own judgment while maintaining the social framework of seeking advice from others. This process often produces better decisions than pure solitary reasoning, as it requires articulating the problem clearly enough to explain it to someone else, even if that someone else exists only in the space between hope and memory. Serve the meal slowly, pausing between bites to allow the absent guest time to consume their portion, even though their portion will remain untouched throughout the meal. This pacing transforms rapid, desperate eating, the consumption style that hunger encourages, into something resembling civilized dining. The pauses provide opportunities to savor what little flavor the food possesses, and to extend the social aspects of the meal beyond the brief time required to consume whatever small amount is available. During these pauses, maintain eye contact with the empty chair where the absent guest sits. This practice feels artificial at first, but becomes natural with repetition, creating a genuine sense of presence that transcends the physical absence. The empty chair begins to develop personality traits inferred from the host's memory of actual guests, or from imagination, about what kind of guest might be worth expecting, despite all evidence suggesting that expecting guests has become an exercise in wishful thinking rather than realistic planning. The weather outside remains consistently unhelpful. Rain that prevents travel, wind that makes any journey uncomfortable, cold that requires fires which consume fuel that might otherwise be saved for cooking. These conditions explain why expected guests fail to arrive and provide reasonable justification for their absence that does not require assuming abandonment or death. The weather serves as a neutral explanation that preserves the possibility of future arrival while acknowledging present absence. Clean both place settings after the meal, though only one was actually used. Wash the absent guest's bowl with the same care given to the bowl that contained actual food, maintaining the equality of treatment that good hospitality demands. Dry both bowls thoroughly and return them to their storage places, ready for the next meal, when another absent guest might be expected or the same absent guest might be expected again. The leftover food from the absent guest's portion should be saved for the next day rather than consumed immediately. This practice serves multiple purposes. It provides the next day's meal without requiring additional foraging or preparation. It honors the absent guest by treating their portion as genuinely theirs rather than as extra food for the host. And it extends the sense of shared meal across multiple days, creating ongoing companionship with someone who exists in the space between memory and hope. Before retiring for the evening, set the table for the next day's meal, including a place for tomorrow's absent guest. Tomorrow's absent guest may be the same person as today's absent guest, or a different person whose arrival seems equally unlikely but equally worth preparing for. The act of setting the table creates a small promise to tomorrow that today's routines will continue, that civilization persists in the form of maintained customs, even when the circumstances that made those customs practical have disappeared entirely. Blow out the candle or extinguish the small fire, but leave the table set in the darkness. The prepared place settings wait patiently through the night, ready for guests who may arrive with the dawn or may not arrive at all, but who remain possible in the space between sleeping and waking, where possibilities seem more substantial than the evidence suggests they should. The dreams that follow meals shared with absent guests often include actual guests, people who arrive at the door carrying news from distant places, bringing food prepared in kitchens where cooking remains possible, offering companionship that fills the silence that even the most patient conversation with absent guests cannot completely eliminate. These dreams provide rest from the effort of maintaining hope in the face of accumulating evidence that hope may be misplaced. Though misplaced hope often proves more sustaining than abandoned hope, even when the sustenance it provides exists primarily in the realm of imagination rather than practical nutrition. Morning arrives with its customary reluctance, bringing another day when absent guests might arrive or might not, when the table set with patient optimism might finally serve its intended purpose, or might continue serving as an expression of faith in possibilities that seem to recede further into the theoretical with each passing day. Yet the table remains set, the invitation remains open, and the meal for the guest who didn't arrive becomes preparation for the meal for the guest who still might, creating a continuous cycle of hope that requires no fuel except the willingness to believe that somewhere, someone might still be traveling toward warmth rather than away from it. The empty bowl catches raindrops that seep through the deteriorating roof, slowly filling with water that might be used for tomorrow's soup or tomorrow's tea, or simply tomorrow's drink for the absent guest, who may finally arrive in time to share whatever tomorrow provides. And in this small accumulation of rainwater in a bowl set for someone who might never come, there is a kind of patience that transcends reason, and a kind of faith that transforms solitude from abandonment into anticipation, making the waiting bearable and the hoping possible, and the setting of places for absent guests, not an act of delusion, but an act of persistent, unreasonable, necessary grace. This course is optional. It exists only in the mind. Eat it slowly and sleep. The final course of any meal during these lean years must accommodate the understanding that endings, like beginnings, have become fluid concepts subject to revision based on circumstances beyond anyone's control. Breadless pudding represents the ultimate achievement in creative cookery, a dish that requires no ingredients, no preparation, no cooking, and no cleaning, yet provides satisfaction that approaches the level of actual food when consumed with proper technique and sufficient imagination. The preparation begins not in the kitchen, but in the mind, which has learned during these years of scarcity to find nourishment in places where the body cannot. Close your eyes and recall the texture of real pudding, smooth and rich, thick enough to coat a spoon, but light enough to dissolve pleasantly on the tongue. Remember the way proper pudding wobbles slightly when moved, the way it holds its shape until disturbed, and then yields gracefully to pressure, the way it clings to the bowl just enough to suggest substance, without becoming difficult to consume. Breadless pudding possesses all these qualities, while requiring none of the ingredients that made traditional pudding possible, when ingredients existed in sufficient quantities to permit traditional cooking. It achieves its consistency through memory rather than milk, its sweetness through longing rather than sugar, its richness through the accumulated experience of better times when pudding could be made from actual materials rather than from the careful cultivation of controlled imagination. The flavor develops according to the cook's ability to recall taste with precision and patience. Begin with simple sweetness, not the overwhelming sweetness of honey when honey was available, but the subtle sweetness of cream that has been warmed gently and allowed to develop its natural sugars through careful attention rather than aggressive heating. Add to this the slight vanilla scent that came from beans, so exotic that their very existence seemed like rumors from distant countries where abundance remained possible. Layer upon this base the memory of eggs that came from chickens that remembered what it felt like to eat grain instead of whatever scraps could found in yards, where nothing grew, and gardens where even weeds had learned to be cautious about committing to the soil. These eggs, when they existed, provided richness that transformed simple mixtures into complex flavors, contributing body and depth that made eating seem like pleasure rather than merely necessary maintenance of biological functions. The preparation technique for breadless pudding requires sitting quietly in a comfortable position, though comfort has become a relative concept, and chairs have often been sacrificed to more pressing needs, like fuel for cooking actual food, when actual food could be obtained. Find whatever seating arrangement allows for relaxation without requiring resources that be the mind to construct the pudding gradually, building its reality spoonful by carefully imagined spoonful. Begin eating the breadless pudding slowly. allowing each imaginary spoonful to develop its full flavor before proceeding to the next. The mind, when properly directed, can recreate taste sensations with remarkable accuracy, particularly when the body has been deprived of actual taste sensations long enough to make the memory of flavor seem more vivid than present hunger. Concentrate on the temperature warm enough to be comforting, but not hot enough to require waiting. Perfectly suited for consumption without delay. The texture should be neither too thick nor too thin, achieving the perfect consistency that real pudding managed when real pudding was possible, and when achieving perfect consistency seemed like a reasonable goal. Releasing flavors that build upon each other to create complexity that approaches the satisfaction once provided by actual desserts in times when desserts were conclusions to meals rather than entirety of meals. Some have mastered the technique of breadless pudding to such a degree that they can taste specific variations. Breadless chocolate pudding, enriched with cocoa, that came from places so distant they might as well have been mythical. Breadless vanilla pudding, made with cream so fresh it seemed to retain the warmth of the cow that produced it. Breadless fruit pudding, incorporating berries that grew wild in summers, when wild things still grew and summers still came regularly, rather than seeming like accidents that might not happen again. The advantage of breadless pudding lies not only in its independence from actual ingredients, but also in its ability to be shared without being diminished. An entire family can consume breadless pudding simultaneously without reducing the amount available for others, making it perhaps the only meal during these times that accommodates generosity without requiring sacrifice. Children can eat as much breadless pudding as they desire without taking food from adults who need sustenance for the more demanding work of keeping everyone alive. The monastery has incorporated breadless pudding into their evening prayers, viewing it as a form of communion with the divine that requires no consecrated elements, because it exists entirely in the realm of spirit rather than matter. The monks find that breadless pudding consumed in groups creates a shared experience of satisfaction that transcends individual hunger, binding the community together through common participation in controlled imagination, rather than through shared scarcity of actual resources. Brother Thomas, who oversees the monastery kitchen where little cooking in that incorporate memories of ingredients from times when the monastery maintained extensive gardens and received regular donations from imaginary soil, enriched by imaginary rain that fell at appropriate times rather than continuously, creating imaginary harvests that fed imaginary meals that left everyone satisfied rather than persistently hungry. The consumption of breadless pudding should be accompanied by appropriate appreciation expressed through small sounds of satisfaction, gentle sighs that acknowledge the pleasure being experienced, soft exclamations that recognize particularly successful flavor combinations, quiet expressions of gratitude for the ability to find nourishment in realms where physical food cannot exist, but mental food remains abundant for those who know how to cultivate it properly. After finishing the breadless pudding, sit quietly and allow the satisfaction to develop fully. The mind, having been encouraged to create the experience of eating something substantial and pleasant, often responds by producing genuine feelings of having been fed, though these feelings must be managed carefully to avoid disappointment when they fade and actual hunger returns. The goal is not to eliminate hunger through imagination, but to create brief respites from hunger that make the overall experience of being hungry more bearable. The dreams that follow meals concluded with breadless pudding tend toward the rich and satisfying dreams of markets filled with actual food, of kitchens where cooking arises from choice rather than desperation, of tables surrounded by people who have come because they want to be present rather than because they have nowhere else to go. These dreams provide rest for minds that have grown tired from the constant work of finding hope in circumstances that seem designed to eliminate hope entirely. Some have learned to extend the experience of breadless pudding by preparing multiple courses of imaginary desserts. Breadless cake with layers of imaginary sweetness, separated by imaginary cream, bread tarts filled with imaginary fruits that grew on imaginary trees, in imaginary orchards where the sun shone regularly and rain fell only when needed. Breadless cookies, crisp with imaginary butter and rich with imaginary spices, that came from countries that still existed and still traded in luxuries, rather than merely struggling to provide necessities. The technique requires practice to master fully, as the mind must be trained to create satisfaction without becoming frustrated by the gap between imagination and reality. Begin with simple breadless puddings before attempting more complex imaginary desserts, and always conclude the imaginary meal before hunger becomes so intense that imagination cannot compete with physical need for attention. There is wisdom in ending meals with breadless pudding, rather than beginning them with imaginary food. Actual hunger, when it dominates consciousness, makes concentration on imaginary eating difficult, and may transform what should be comfort into frustration at the difference between what the mind can create and what the body requires. But hunger that has been partially addressed by whatever actual food could be obtained becomes more manageable and more willing to accept imaginary satisfaction as a reasonable conclusion to inadequate but actual nutrition. The cleaning that follows breadless pudding requires only wiping away the memory of sweetness from imaginary spoons and rinsing. Imaginary bowls in imaginary water heated over imaginary fires that burn cleanly without producing smoke or consuming fuel needed for actual cooking. This cleaning takes no time and uses no resources while providing the psychological satisfaction of completing the meal properly, maintaining the customs that connect present circumstances to better times when customs were supported by abundance rather than sustained purely through determination. Store any remaining breadless pudding in the mind's pantry, where it will keep indefinitely without spoiling and remain available for future meals. When actual food proves even more difficult to obtain than usual. The mind's pantry, unlike actual pantries, never empties completely and never requires restocking through foraging or trade or the cultivation of crops that refuse to grow in soil that has forgotten how to nurture anything except disappointment. Before sleep, consider the day's accomplishments in the realm of imaginary cooking. breadless pudding prepared with skill and consumed with appreciation represents a victory over circumstances that seem designed to eliminate all victories, large and small. The ability to find satisfaction where no material satisfaction exists demonstrates human adaptability at its most creative and most necessary. The rain continues against the shutters with its usual persistence, washing the world clean of the day's small disappointments, while preparing tomorrow's mud for tomorrow's meals, and tomorrow's hopes for tomorrow's absent guests. But inside, warmed by imaginary fires and satisfied by imaginary food, the mind rests in temporary peace, having learned to create sustenance from memory and hope, to find nourishment in the space between what was and what might yet be. Sleep comes easily after meals that end with breadless pudding, carrying with it dreams of abundance that feel more real than present scarcity, more substantial than actual hunger, more nourishing than any food the body has received in months. And in these dreams, the great famine becomes merely one season among many, difficult but temporary, survived through patience and creativity and the quiet determination to find grace in circumstances where grace seemed impossible but proved, against all reasonable expectation, to be waiting patiently for those who learnt how to recognize it in forms they never would have imagined, accepting when accepting such forms seemed like choice rather than necessity. The breadless pudding dissolves into sleep that tastes of better times and promises of seasons, when rain will nourish rather than destroy, when cooking will express creativity rather than desperation, when meals will conclude with actual desserts shared with actual guests who arrive punctually and leave satisfied. Until then, there is breadless pudding, patient and reliable and infinitely renewable, waiting in the mind's pantry to provide what the body cannot have and the heart cannot quite abandon hoping for. And it is enough. For now, it is enough. Close your eyes, taste the sweetness that exists only in memory and hope and sleep. Panis angelicus, fit panis hominum, the bread of angels becomes the bread of mortals, even when there is no bread at all.